Widow's daughter found a half-dead cowboy in the snow, but his secret left her speechless. The horse screamed. Clara dropped the firewood and ran toward the sound, her boots breaking through the frozen crust of snow that had fallen all night. The scream came again, wild, panicked, cutting through the silence of the Wyoming morning like a blade through cloth. She found him 30 yards from the house, face down in the snow. The blood had already spread beneath him, dark and steaming against the white. His horse stood a few feet away, reins tangled in the sagebrush, sides heaving, eyes wide with terror. Clara's breath caught in her chest. She had seen dead men before. The West didn't let you grow up without seeing death. But this man wasn't dead yet. His fingers were still moving. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into the cold, and rolled him onto his back. His face was pale as bone, lips cracked and blue, frost clinging to his beard. His coat was soaked through with blood, too much blood, and she couldn't tell where it was coming from. A gunshot, maybe, or a knife. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was still breathing. "Can you hear me?" she said, her voice sharp in the stillness. His eyes opened, just barely. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and for a moment they focused on her face. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp. Clara didn't think. She hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him toward the house. He was heavier than she expected. Taller, too. A cowboy, by the look of him, worn leather chaps, spurs on his boots, a gun belt around his waist. She didn't check the gun. She didn't care if he was an outlaw or a rancher or a drifter running from the law. All she cared about was getting him inside before the cold finished what the blood loss had started. Her mother had warned her about strangers. Never trust a man you don't know, Clara. Not out here. Not in this country. But her mother had been dead 3 winters now, and Clara had learned that survival didn't leave room for caution. You helped or you didn't. You lived with your choices, or you buried them. She pulled him through the door and onto the floor near the stove, where the fire still burned low from the night before. His head lolled to the side, and that's when she saw it. The locket. It hung from a leather cord around his neck, half hidden beneath his blood-soaked shirt. Silver, tarnished with age, the kind of thing a man didn't carry unless it meant something. Clara's hands froze. She knew that locket. She had seen it before, not on this man, but in a photograph her mother kept buried at the bottom of an old trunk in the corner of the room. Her heart began to pound. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and lifted the locket from his chest. It was cold and heavy in her palm. She turned it over, and there, engraved on the back in faint, delicate script, were 2 initials. E.M. Elizabeth Monroe. Her mother's name. Clara's breath stopped. The room seemed to tilt. She stared at the locket, then at the man's face, and something deep inside her chest cracked open like ice under pressure. She didn't know him. She had never seen him before in her life. But he had known her mother. He had carried her name, her memory, across however many miles, through however many years, close to his heart. Her hands shook as she set the locket down and began tearing at his coat, pulling it open to find the wound. There, a gash along his ribs, deep and ragged, still bleeding, but slower now. Not a gunshot. A knife, maybe. Or barbed wire. She didn't know. It didn't matter. She worked quickly, the way her mother had taught her. Boiled water. Clean cloth. Whiskey poured over the wound to burn out infection. He didn't wake. Didn't flinch. His breathing stayed shallow, uneven, like a man balanced on the edge of something he couldn't climb back from. Clara stitched him up with thread meant for sewing quilts, her hand steady even though her mind was not. She wrapped his ribs with strips of an old sheet, then covered him with a wool blanket and sat back on her heels, staring at him in the firelight. Who was he? And why had he been carrying her mother's locket? She thought of her mother's face, the way she used to smile in the mornings, humming old hymns while she kneaded bread. The way she never spoke about the years before Clara was born. The way she would sometimes stand at the window and stare out at the horizon, as if she were waiting for something that would never come. Clara had always thought her mother's silence was grief. Her father had died when Clara was just a baby, thrown from a horse, they said. Her mother had raised her alone after that, in this cabin on the edge of nowhere, teaching her to shoot, to ride, to survive. But her mother had never remarried, never even spoke of other men. Clara had thought it was loyalty to her father's memory. But now, looking at the stranger on her floor, she wasn't so sure. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the blood in the yard. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and fed another log into the stove. The fire crackled and hissed, filling the room with warmth. The man didn't move. She sat beside him through the night, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the labored rhythm of his breathing. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Her mind kept circling back to the locket, to the initials engraved on its surface, to the questions she didn't have answers for. By the time dawn came, pale and cold through the frosted window, Clara had made a decision. If he lived, she would ask him. She would demand the truth about the locket, about her mother, about whatever past he had carried into her life on the edge of death. And if he died, she would bury him in the snow beside the house, and she would never know. But something told her he wouldn't die. Not yet. Men like him, men who carried lockets and rode alone through winter storms, didn't die easy. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white, empty world beyond. The snow had stopped. The sky was gray and heavy, pressing down on the land like a hand. Somewhere out there, someone might be looking for him. Llama maybe. Or enemies. Or ghosts. Clara didn't care. She had dragged him out of the snow, and now his story was tangled with hers, whether she wanted it to be or not. Elizabeth. Clara froze in the doorway, the bowl of broth trembling in her hands. The cowboy was dreaming again, his head rolling side to side on the pillow, his lips moving in fevered whispers. She had heard him say it before over the past 5 days. Names she didn't recognize, places she'd never been. But always, eventually, he came back to that one name, her mother's name. Elizabeth, he whispered again, his voice broken and raw. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Clara set the bowl down on the small table beside the bed and pressed her hand to his forehead. Still burning. The fever hadn't broken yet, though the wound had stopped bleeding. She had changed his bandages twice a day, kept the fire going, forced water between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. But he hadn't truly woken. Not once. Until now. His eyes opened, sudden and sharp, and locked onto hers. Clara pulled her hand back, her heart hammering in her chest. His gaze was steady, clear, no longer clouded with fever. He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to place her in a memory he couldn't quite reach. Then he spoke. Does she still sing in the mornings? The words hit her like a slap. Clara's throat closed. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to turn away, to leave the room, to pretend she hadn't heard him. But she couldn't move. She could only stand there, rooted to the floor, staring at this stranger who knew things he had no right to know. Who are you? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening, and for a moment she thought he might slip back into sleep. But then he opened them again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Something heavy, something that looked like grief. My name is Thomas, he said quietly. Thomas Creed. Clara shook her head. The name meant nothing to her. She had never heard her mother speak it, never seen it written in any letter or diary. But the way he said it, slow and careful, like a man confessing a sin, made her stomach twist. You didn't answer my question, she said, her voice harder now. How do you know my mother? Thomas shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. He sat up slowly, leaning back against the wooden headboard, his face pale and drawn. He looked older in the daylight, lines carved deep around his eyes, gray threading through his dark hair. A man worn down by years on the trail, by too many towns and too many goodbyes. I knew her a long time ago, he said finally. Before you were born. Clara's chest tightened. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. They stared at each other in the dim light of the room. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and the fire crackled softly in the stove. Clara felt something inside her crack, the careful wall she had built around her mother's memory, around the life they had lived together in this cabin on the edge of nowhere. She had thought she knew her mother, thought she understood the woman who had raised her alone, who had taught her to survive, who had never once mentioned a man named Thomas Creed. But she had been wrong. "Tell me," Clara said, her voice shaking. "Tell me the truth, or I'll put you back out in the snow." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He reached up slowly and pulled the locket from beneath his shirt, holding it in his palm. The silver caught the light, dull and tarnished, the initials still faintly visible on its surface. "She gave this to me," he said quietly, 15 years ago. "The day I left." Clara's breath stopped. "I was a ranch hand back then," Thomas continued, his voice low and steady, "working on a spread outside of Cheyenne. Your mother, Elizabeth, she was the rancher's daughter. Beautiful, smart, too good for someone like me. But we fell in love anyway. The kind of love that doesn't ask permission. The kind that burns." He paused, his thumb brushing over the locket's surface. "We were going to run away together," he said. "Head west, find a place where no one knew us, start over." She was ready. I was ready. But then her father found out. He threatened to disown her, cut her off from everything. And Elizabeth, she had a younger brother who depended on her, a mother who was sick. She couldn't just leave. Clara felt her chest tighten, her hands trembling at her sides. "So I told her I'd wait," Thomas said. "I told her I'd go ahead, find work, save money, and come back for her when things settled. She gave me this locket the night I left, told me to keep it safe, told me it would remind me of the promise we made." He closed his hand around the locket, his knuckles white. "I waited 2 years," he said. "Worked myself half to death on a cattle drive in Montana. Sent letters. Never got a reply. So I came back to Cheyenne, ready to take her away no matter what her father said. But when I got there, she was gone. The ranch had been sold. Her family had moved. No one would tell me where." His voice cracked, just barely. "I spent the next 10 years looking for her," he said. "Followed rumors, tracked down old ranch hands, rode through every dusty town between Wyoming and Texas. And then one day, I heard about a widow living alone with her daughter in a cabin near the mountains. A woman named Elizabeth Monroe." Clara's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. "I came here 3 weeks ago," Thomas said. "Stood outside that window for an hour, watching the light inside, trying to work up the courage to knock. But I couldn't do it, because I realized something. She had moved on. She had built a life without me, and I had no right to walk back into it and tear it apart." He looked up at Clara, and his eyes were wet. "So I turned around," he said. "Rode back into the hills. Told myself I'd let her go. But then I ran into trouble, a fight over a card game, a man with a knife. And by the time I realized how bad it was, I was bleeding out in the snow. My horse brought me here. I don't know if you remember the place, or if it was just luck. But when I woke up and saw your face, I thought I was dreaming. Because you looked just like her." Clara's hands were shaking. She wanted to scream, wanted to hit him, wanted to demand why he had come here, why he had brought this pain into her life, why her mother had never told her any of this. But instead, she asked the only question that mattered. "Did she ever mention you?" she whispered. "Did she ever talk about you? Even once?" Thomas looked at her, and the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. And Clara knew. Her mother had buried him, buried the memory of him so deep that not even her own daughter had ever glimpsed it. But the silence her mother had kept didn't mean the love had died. It meant it had hurt too much to speak. The letter was yellowed at the edges, folded so many times the creases had worn thin as spider silk. Thomas pulled it from his saddlebag with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and Clara felt her heart drop into her stomach. She knew what it was before he even said a word. She could see it in the way he held it, careful, reverent, like something sacred. like something that had the power to break him. "She wrote to me," he said quietly. "Once. Only once." Clara stared at the envelope in his hands. Her mother's handwriting. She would know it anywhere. The careful loops, the slanted letters, the way the ink pressed heavier on certain words. It was unmistakable. "When?" she whispered. 10 years ago, Thomas said. "Maybe more. I found it waiting for me in a town in Colorado. A postmaster had been holding it for months, trying to track me down through the ranch circuits. By the time it reached me, I'd already given up looking for her." He turned the letter over in his hands, and Clara saw that the seal had never been broken. Her breath caught. "You never read it?" Thomas shook his head. "No. Why not?" He was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the paper in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of what it would say. Afraid it would tell me she was married, that she was happy, that she wanted me to stop looking. I thought if I never opened it, I could keep believing that somewhere, somehow, we still had a chance." Clara felt something twist inside her chest. She wanted to be angry at him, wanted to rage at this drifter who had loved her mother and then run away, who had carried a letter for 10 years but never had the courage to read it. But she couldn't, because she understood. Sometimes not knowing was easier than the truth. "Open it," she said, her voice hard. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "Please," Clara said, softer this time. "I need to know." He nodded slowly. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal, the wax crumbling after so many years. He unfolded the letter carefully, and Clara saw the paper was covered in her mother's handwriting, lines and lines of it, filling both sides. Thomas stared at the words, but he didn't read them. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too hard. "I can't," he whispered. "I thought I could, but I can't." Clara stepped forward and took the letter from his hands. He didn't resist. He just sat there, his face pale, his eyes empty, like a man waiting for judgment. She looked down at the paper, and her mother's voice filled her mind, clear and strong and achingly familiar. "Thomas," she read aloud, her voice breaking on the first word. She stopped, swallowed hard, and began again. "Thomas, by the time you read this, I will have made a choice I can never take back. I need you to know that it wasn't because I stopped loving you. I never stopped. Not for a single day. But love isn't always enough, and I learned that the hard way." Clara's hands tightened on the paper. She could feel Thomas watching her, but she didn't look up. She couldn't. "My father died 2 months after you left. A heart attack, sudden and cruel. My mother fell apart. My brother was only 14, too young to run the ranch, too young to carry the weight my father left behind. And I was all they had, the only one strong enough to hold us together." Clara's throat closed. She had never known her mother had a brother, had never heard a single story about a ranch or a family in Cheyenne. Her mother had carried all of this alone, locked away where no one could see it. "I waited for your letters, Thomas. Every day I walked to the post office, praying there would be something from you. But nothing came. Weeks turned into months. And I started to believe you had changed your mind, that you had found someone else, that I had been foolish to think a ranch hand and a rancher's daughter could ever make it work." Thomas made a sound, low and broken, and Clara glanced up. His face was in his hands, his shoulders shaking. She looked back at the letter, her vision blurring with tears. "Then I met someone else. A good man. A widower with a kind heart and steady hands. He didn't make me feel the way you did. There was no fire, no burning. But there was safety, security, a future. And I was so tired, Thomas. So tired of waiting for something that might never come." Clara's voice cracked, but she forced herself to keep reading. "We married in the spring. It was a small ceremony, just the preacher and a few neighbors. I wore my mother's dress. I didn't cry. I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was being practical, that love wasn't everything." She paused, her hands trembling. 3 months later, I found out I was pregnant. With Clara. My daughter. The only good thing that came from a marriage built on ashes. Her father was thrown from a horse before she turned 1. He died instantly. And I became a widow before I ever really became a wife. Clara's chest felt like it was caving in. She had spent her whole life believing her father was a hero, a man her mother had loved deeply, whose death had broken her. But it had been a lie. Not a cruel one, just a quiet one. The kind mothers tell to protect their children from the weight of their own regrets. I'm writing this because I heard you were looking for me. Someone saw you in a town 2 days' ride from here, asking about a woman named Elizabeth. And I need you to stop, Thomas. Please. Stop looking. Not because I don't love you, but because I do. Because if you show up at my door, I don't know if I'll have the strength to send you away. And Clara deserves better than a mother who chose her own heart over her child's future. Clara's voice broke completely. She couldn't keep reading, but she forced herself to look at the last lines, written in handwriting that looked rushed, desperate. I will always carry you with me, in every sunrise, in every song, in every moment of silence, when I let myself remember what we could have been. But that's where you have to stay, Thomas. In my memory, not in my life. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The letter ended there. No signature. No goodbye. Just silence. Clara lowered the paper, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Thomas, and he looked back at her with eyes that had finally broken open. And in that moment, they both understood. Her mother hadn't buried him because she stopped loving him. She buried him because she loved him too much. The sky broke open at dawn, spilling light across the snow like water over stone. Clara stood at the window, watching the world turn gold and white, and she knew he would leave today. She had known it since the moment the storm ended, since the moment the wind stopped howling and the silence settled over the land like a blanket. Men like Thomas Creed didn't stay. They couldn't. The road was in their blood, and no amount of warmth or kindness or answers could pull out. She heard him moving in the back room, the creak of the bed frame, the slow shuffle of boots on wood. He had been up for hours, she suspected, packing his saddlebag, checking his wound, preparing to ride out before she could ask him not to. But Clara wasn't going to ask. She had spent the night thinking about her mother's letter, about the words her mother had written 10 years ago, words meant to set Thomas free, but had only chained him to the past, about the life her mother had built on silence and sacrifice, on choices that had seemed right at the time, but had left scars no one could see. And Clara had realized something. Her mother had loved Thomas Creed, had loved him in a way that was deep and true and impossible to forget. But she had also loved Clara, had chosen Clara, had built a life around her daughter, even if it meant burying the man who still held half her heart. That wasn't weakness. That was strength. The door to the back room opened, and Thomas stepped out, his saddlebag slung over his shoulder, his coat buttoned against the cold. He looked better than he had a week ago, stronger, steadier, but there was still something hollow in his eyes, something that would never fully heal. "You're leaving," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. "Yeah." She turned away from the window and looked at him. He stood in the center of the room, his hat in his hands, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. He didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of this, for showing up here, for bringing the past back when it should have stayed buried." Clara crossed her arms over her chest. "You didn't bring it back. It was always here. I just didn't know it." Thomas looked up at her then, and she saw the pain in his face, raw and unguarded. The pain of a man who had spent 15 years running from something he could never outrun. "Your mother was a good woman," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "The best I ever knew. And I wasted so much time looking for her. Time I could have spent building something real. But I couldn't let go. I couldn't accept that she had moved on." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to be angry at him, wanted to tell him he had no right to mourn a woman who had chosen someone else, who had built a life without him. But she couldn't. Because she understood now. Her mother hadn't moved on. She had just learned to live with the weight of what she had lost. She never forgot you, Clara said softly. Thomas closed his eyes, his hands tightening around the brim of his hat. I know, he whispered. And that's what makes it worse. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past pressing down on them like the snow outside. Then Clara walked to the corner of the room, to the old trunk where her mother had kept her most precious things. She knelt beside it and lifted the lid, her hands moving through folded quilts and worn Bibles until she found what she was looking for. Another letter. This one was sealed, the envelope crisp and white, the handwriting familiar. Clara had found it 3 years ago, the week after her mother died. It had been tucked inside her mother's journal, hidden beneath a pressed wildflower and a lock of baby hair. Clara had never opened it, had never even looked at the name written on the front. But she had known, somehow, that it was for him. She stood and crossed the room, holding the letter out to Thomas. He stared at it, his face going pale. What is this? He asked. She wrote it the year she died, Clara said. I don't know why she never sent it. Maybe she didn't know where you were. Maybe she thought it was too late. But it's yours. It was always yours. Thomas took the letter with shaking hands, turning it over slowly. His name was written on the front in her mother's careful script. Thomas Creed. Nothing else. Just his name, like a prayer. I haven't read it, Clara said. And I won't. Whatever she wanted to say to you, it's between the two of you, not me. Thomas looked at her, his eyes wet with tears he was too proud to let fall. Thank you, he said, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. Thomas tucked the letter carefully into his coat pocket, right next to the first one. Then he picked up his saddlebag and slung it over his shoulder. He walked to the door and stopped, his hand on the latch, his back to her. She sang every morning, Clara said suddenly. Thomas froze. Even after you left, Clara continued, her voice steady now. Even after she married someone else. Even after she became a widow. She sang every single morning. Old hymns, mostly. Songs her mother taught her. And sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window while she sang, like she was looking for something. Or someone. Thomas turned slowly, his face twisted with grief. She never stopped waiting for you, Clara said quietly. Not really. But she also never regretted choosing me. And I think she needed you to know that. That both things could be true at the same time. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the floor. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. His horse was waiting by the fence, saddled and ready, its breath steaming in the frozen light. Clara followed him to the door and watched as he mounted. He sat tall in the saddle, his coat pulled tight against the wind, the 2 letters pressed against his chest like armor. He looked down at her, and for a moment she saw him the way her mother must have seen him all those years ago, young and strong and full of hope. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, Clara replied. He turned his horse toward the horizon, toward the open land that stretched endlessly in every direction. The snow was melting in the sunlight, revealing patches of brown earth and dead grass. Spring was coming. Eventually. Clara watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller and smaller until he disappeared into the brightness. She didn't cry, didn't call after him. She just stood there, her hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the cold air on her face. And then she closed the door, not with anger, not with sadness, but with the quiet, aching peace that comes when you finally understand that the people you love were flawed and broken and human long before they were yours, and that their choices, no matter how painful, were made with love.